Hello, I'm Ellen Vince, coming today from Wheaton, Illinois in the USA. Welcome to Impact, a podcast about how we could each bring about real change in the world and getting practical in making that happen.
And hello, I'm Clive Johnson, coming today from Leigh-on-Sea in the UK. A special welcome if you're listening for the first time, and a big thank you to our new subscribers. Each week, we look at one aspect of how we can connect our hearts to offer healing for others with our collective intention, prayers, and meditation, and go behind the headlines of a critical happening in our world that needs our attention right now.
In today's episode, we take one of these regular deep dives to more fully understand and tune in with something many of us may know only a little about, and see where we might hone in with our prayers and intentions. And as we record, it's November 13th, 2024.
Time pressing on towards the end of this year, and indeed, it's very nearly, I just realized, it's very nearly a year since Impact began.
That's right. It is. Yeah, us.
My goodness. So here we are, 1 year on.
Yeah.
But sadly, topic today is nearly 3 years on, and specifically the 1,000-day milestone is rapidly approaching of the war between Russia and Ukraine. That milestone will be reached on the 19th of November this year, and it's already become the deadliest war in Europe since the Second World War. Ukraine has recaptured around 54% of the territory initially occupied by Russia, although Russia still occupies around 18% of former Ukrainian territory. The war has seen major events, as we know, such as the siege of Mariupol, the battle for Kyiv, many counteroffensives, and ongoing struggles in the Donbass region to the east of Ukraine. The war's longevity has had far-reaching consequences, including a refugee crisis, global economic impacts, an energy crisis in Europe, and severe restriction of vital wheat exports to Africa, and a reshaping of international alliances. And this is staggering. It's thought that the war has cost approximately 1 million casualties, including deaths and injuries, among both Ukrainians and Russians, mostly military personnel, although estimates vary widely. Relief workers in Ukraine observe that the conflict is now expanding, both geographically and in terms of the frequency and intensity of attacks. And at the time of our recording, there appears to be no prospect of an imminent end to hostilities. So as this 1,000 days milestone of the conflict approaches, the politics, morality, and prospects for ending the war will be discussed anew by many in the coming days. These aren't our focus today. Rather, in the first of 2 special episodes marking this relentless and horrific conflict's awful milestone, we look at the impacts for ordinary people on both sides of the war. In other words, those who played no part in starting or, in the main, wanting war. This week, we turn our attention to the war's consequences for civilians in Russia.
Something we don't often think of, right?
Exactly.
You know, we just think of the victims in Ukraine. So how is the war affecting ordinary people in Russia? Well, in our research for this episode, it became clear that it's not easy to build an accurate picture of the impacts of the Russia-Ukraine war on the ordinary people in Russia, at least how life is now compared with how it may be longer term. For some, the consequences appear to be significant. However, the impacts for many others may not be as severe as might be expected, and support for the war among Russians remains high. According to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, this is because most Russians believe it is their duty to support their country's actions. Most have come to terms with the war, seemingly accepting that it may drag on for a long time. Impacts are being felt in the economy, but not in ways that might be expected. Surprisingly, perhaps Russia's economy has actually grown during the war, and at a higher rate than the world economy as a whole, confounding analysts' expectations. Russia is prominent among the BRICS nations, which have not imposed the punishing sanctions on the country implemented by the West. In 2023, Russia's GDP grew to a rate of about 3.5%, although a significant shift in its economy has been toward production for the war effort. And while more than 12 million people in Russia lived under the poverty line in 2023, data analyst Statista says that this actually marks a considerable decrease compared to the previous year. However, a focus on military spending is having a significant impact on civilian life, especially on infrastructure. This winter, heating infrastructure broke down across large areas of the country, with Russian news media reporting that over 70% of the nation's municipal infrastructure had deteriorated. Russian families are noticing the impacts. In one survey earlier this year, pollster Russian Field found that 35% of respondents said that their family's standard of living had fallen since the start of the war. The same poll revealed that over half of the respondents reported having negative emotions when they heard news about the specialty military operation, as the war is officially called in Russia.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it? These
I actually thought more than 35%.
Yeah.
Would say that their standard of living had fallen.
Exactly. This is what really surprised me, is that seemingly for a lot of Russians, life is going on more or less as normal.
Yes.
There have been some changes, but it's not as radical as we might imagine. Now, 12 months military service is required for men in Russia. There is national service, conscription. However, in 2023, Russia's parliament extended this compulsory military service to all men between the ages of 18 and 30, meaning that any who are in this age group can be conscripted. They're not meant to be sent into action until they've completed several months' training, although there have been reports of quite young conscripts ending up in combat zones. And there are at least 300,000 reservists who were previously partially mobilized as Russia faced heavy casualties on the battlefield. Along with families of professional soldiers, this partial mobilization has affected many families, with partners and parents being separated for long periods of time, anxious for their loved ones' safety. And two, there are many who are grieving those who've lost their lives or suffered life-changing injuries. Mothers who are anxious for their young sons receiving call-up papers, and those on the front line themselves facing fatigue, fear, and the horror of being part of a war machine in a conflict many may not wish to fight. As many as 260,000 potential conscripts have fled the country, not knowing when they may be able to return or what circumstances they may face when they do. There have been some displacements of families living near Russia's border with Ukraine due to safety concerns as a result of the war. And this includes the evacuation of at least 8,000 children. However, the level of displacement is far less significant in scale than that's been seen in Ukraine, which we'll be talking about next week. The human rights group OVD Info also points to the price of protest, saying that nearly 20,000 people were detained for anti-war actions in Russia between February 2022 and the end of January this year. And even on the date of our recording, there was a doctor sentenced, I believe, to 5 years imprisonment for making anti-war comments to a patient who reported her.
That's horrible.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? Really horrible. The patient, I believe, had lost her partner or a loved one in the war. So I guess it was just an insensitive thing to say, perhaps, but we don't really know the context there. It certainly wouldn't be something that should lead to such a punishment. Russian citizens are feeling some consequences of Western sanctions imposed on the country since the start of the war. There have been, since that time, nearly 11,000 new restrictions placed on Russian individuals, companies, products, and technologies. And prices for imported goods have risen due to more expensive schemes for circumventing sanctions. Russia's central bank was banned from using US dollars early on in the war, with the Moscow Exchange and its subsidiaries, the National Clearing Center and National Settlement Depository, being added to the sanctions list this year, effectively isolating sanctioned companies from the global dollar system. As a result, the Chinese yuan has become the main currency of exchange trading in Russia, as the ruble exchange rate has become volatile. But to date, sanctions have largely impacted defense, technology, construction, aerospace, and manufacturing industries. And this includes in areas where Western companies, consulting, part supply, and support for large corporations. So, for example, software systems like Oracle and SaaS, and aircraft parts needed for Russia's airline fleets, which are mainly operated using Boeing and Airbus aircraft, are being affected.
Well, we've not been able to establish whether such a fallout is occurring. It's likely that company failures, job losses, and inflating costs are common. Many major Western companies have stopped selling and making goods in Russia, or are now prevented from exporting to the country, meaning that Russians have limited access to Western products. Homegrown alternatives may often be available, as well as imports from China and other countries that have not isolated Russian trade. However, this isn't always the case. The pharmaceuticals industry, for example, is heavily dependent on imported raw materials. Consistent shortages of different kinds of medical supplies, including some hormonal and cancer treatment medications and prosthesis, have caused misery to many, with substitutes often not being available. Drugs for diabetics, including insulin, have been in short supply since sanctions were imposed. Despite these challenges, the Russian government maintains a strong grip on power and continues to shape public narrative around the war. The full extent of the war's impact on ordinary Russians may not be fully apparent or acknowledged within Russia itself.
Yeah, and certainly not necessarily being reported. So it is hard, as we said earlier, to get an accurate picture. But perhaps because of Russia's very prominent place among the BRICS nations, so with Brazil, India, China, and South Africa, essentially being important trading partners in such areas as energy, which was where formerly Europe was such an important trading partner, and also a means for obtaining most of the raw materials needed for at least most things. It seems to me that sanctions aren't really having a very big effect. So perhaps, as we said, then having some impact on the cost of items, but not actually, with the exception of some of the drugs and insulin and so on being in short supply, not really having a massive effect. So how many Russians have died or been seriously injured in the war? The exact number who have been killed or seriously injured isn't known. The United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine says that it believes far more Ukrainian civilians have been killed than Russians, with Russian casualties mainly being in the border areas. Moscow, and this will be true of Kyiv as well, hasn't announced an official casualty toll at any point. One independent media outlet within Russia, the Moscow Times, which is now marginalized by the state as an undesirable organization, although it's still operating, recently reported that 80 civilians had been killed since the invasions began. And in August, the Kremlin-friendly news agency TASS reported that around 100 people had been killed during Ukraine's incursion into Kursk. Meanwhile, the independent Russian media outlet Mediazona says that at least 71,000 Russian soldiers have been confirmed killed as a result of the war, although some believe this number is far less than the reality. Citing US military data, The Economist put the number of Russian soldiers who have been killed, injured, or captured, and this was by the middle of this year, at being between 462,000 and 728,000.
That's a big difference.
Yeah. It just, I think, shows how difficult it is to form estimates. And I think Mediazona has done very detailed audits on death certificates or records of, publicly recorded records of those who died as a result of military action. So the numbers it confirms is certainly likely to be far less than reality, because it's only been able to perhaps audit a certain number.
Wow. So where might we hone in with our intention and prayers? To commemorate this grim milestone, the United Nations Security Council, UNSC, is planning to hold a special session on November 18th, 2024. This will be chaired by UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy as the United Kingdom holds the UNSC presidency this month. This session aims to address several key issues, including reviewing the ongoing conflict and its global repercussions, reaffirming support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and discussing Russia's military partnerships, including alleged arrangements with North Korea and Iran, which are claimed to be further destabilizing various regions, of course. Let us will that wise counsel will prevail at the UNSC special session, and that decisions and routes for influence will result that show compassion for Russia's people, alongside exerting pressure for the war to end. And let us will for those suffering because of medical supply sanctions to be well cared for, and wisdom for those treating them. And let us will for those grieving loss of loved ones or whose lives have otherwise been radically changed because of the war. And let us will for families separated, including those displaced in border areas, including children who have been evacuated. Let us will for courage, perseverance, and wisdom for the opponents of the war, including those detained or otherwise penalized because of their views, and for those who have left the country fearing repression or being conscripted.
And let us will for support and provision for all that we can't see, what's unreported, what's unknown, what's happening behind the scenes, including the many secondary, but in turn direct impacts of the war on individuals' lives. And as our suggested main intention focus for this week, as Russian citizens continue to bear the impacts of the country's war with Ukraine, we suggest holding as our main intention, we will that all Russian citizens will be guided and protected in coping with all emotional, mental, and physical effects on their lives resulting from their country's war with Ukraine. Please join us in holding this. And as we mentioned before, we'll be focusing next week on the lives of ordinary people in Ukraine. I don't know whether we perhaps should have used this term ordinary people, if there is such a thing. But I think we're saying here, those who are not themselves responsible for military decisions and for the
right
and so on.
Right, who have no control over this.
Have no control. Yeah, that's really what we mean. Yeah.
We don't often think of that. It's easy to not think of it.
It is.
It's important.
Yes.
Remember it exists.
Yeah. And especially, I think, when here in the West, most of the stories we hear are coming from Ukraine. That's where most journalists are. And there is understandably an interest among Western nations, Western media, Western journalists very often to portray, especially what is happening in Ukraine. So we will be coming to focus on that next week. But we do not, as we said earlier, tend to hear so much about the impacts on those without control of what's happening in Russia.
Right.
That about wraps it up for this episode. Remember, you can connect with us in the Facebook group and for live intention holding in my daily Insight Timer offerings, and with Ellen in the Labyrinth Activist Network's Zoom calls. Details of how to hook up with these are in our show notes. Look out too for our next special topic episode, which we'll be releasing in the next few days. Thank you for listening and for sharing with us in Holding Intentions. We look forward to connecting again next time. And in the meantime, thank you, go well, stay safe.
And remember, we're more powerful together.
Impact is presented by Ellen Bintz and Clive Johnson and produced by Impact Productions. Our theme music is by Chris Collins and our logo artwork is by Auto Classic. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible, or your favorite podcast provider. We're a non-commercial podcast dedicated to people of any faith tradition or none who yearn for healing in our troubled world. Please pass on the word so others may join us in making an impact. Thank you for listening.